Margaret Chen never thought she belonged in the Blackwood family. While her great-uncle Harold lived in a massive mansion with marble floors and golden chandeliers, she worked double shifts at the local diner just to pay rent on her tiny apartment. The Blackwoods were the kind of rich people who owned 3 cars but complained when their coffee was 2 degrees too cold. Margaret was the kind of person who said thank you to the bus driver and left extra tips even when money was tight. Her connection to the family fortune came through her grandmother, who had been Harold's brother. But that brother died young, leaving behind a wife and daughter who struggled to make ends meet. Harold never helped them. He was too busy building his real estate empire, buying up properties all over the state and turning them into luxury developments. By the time Margaret was born, the family connection felt more like a distant memory than a real relationship. Margaret had only met Harold Blackwood 3 times in her entire life. Once at her grandmother's funeral when she was 12, once at a family reunion she wished she hadn't attended, and once completely by accident at the grocery store 2 years ago. That last meeting was awkward. Harold seemed surprised to see her, like he had forgotten she existed. They made small talk for maybe 2 minutes before he hurried away with his expensive shopping cart full of organic everything. So when Harold's lawyer called on a rainy Tuesday morning, Margaret almost didn't answer. The number looked official and scary, the kind that usually meant bad news about bills or late payments. But something made her pick up. "Ms. Chen, this is Attorney Williams from the Blackwood estate. I'm calling about your great-uncle Harold's will." Margaret's first thought was that maybe Harold had left her some debt to deal with. Rich people, she figured, probably had complicated financial problems even after they died. She certainly wasn't expecting to inherit anything valuable. "There's been a reading of the will scheduled for this Friday at 2 o'clock. Your presence is required as you've been named as a beneficiary." A beneficiary. The word sounded foreign in Margaret's mouth when she repeated it to her best friend Rosa later that day. Rosa worked at the diner too, and they often joked about what they would do if they ever won the lottery. Neither of them had ever actually known someone who inherited real money. "Maybe he left you his watch or something," Rosa said, refilling the coffee pot. "Rich people always leave random relatives their jewelry." Margaret doubted it would be anything that valuable. Harold hadn't exactly been the sentimental type. Friday arrived faster than she expected. Margaret put on her only good dress, the black one she wore to job interviews and funerals, and took 2 buses to get to the lawyer's office downtown. The building was the kind of place that made her feel underdressed just walking through the lobby. Everything was polished marble and dark wood, with paintings that probably cost more than she made in a year. The waiting room was already full when she arrived. She recognized Harold's nephew Richard immediately. He looked exactly like the kind of person who had never worked a real job in his life. His suit probably cost more than Margaret's rent, and he kept checking his expensive watch like the meeting was interrupting something more important. Next to him sat his sister Victoria, who was scrolling through her phone and sighing dramatically every few minutes. There were other relatives too, people Margaret didn't recognize, but who all had that same polished look that came with old money. They glanced at her when she walked in, taking in her discount store dress and worn shoes, then looked away like she wasn't worth their attention. Attorney Williams was exactly what Margaret expected a rich family's lawyer to look like. Silver hair, expensive glasses, and the kind of confident voice that made even simple statements sound official and important. He opened a thick folder and began reading from Harold's will in that special lawyer language that made everything sound more complicated than it needed to be. Richard inherited the main mansion, complete with its 10 bedrooms, indoor pool, and 3-car garage. Victoria got Harold's vacation home in the mountains, plus his collection of luxury cars. Other relatives received investment portfolios, jewelry collections, and shares in Harold's various business ventures. Each bequest was worth hundreds of, thousands, sometimes millions of dollars. Margaret sat quietly in the back, watching the family's faces light up as their inheritances were announced. She started to wonder why she was even there. Maybe Harold had left her a small amount of money, just enough to be polite, but not enough to matter. Then Attorney Williams cleared his throat and looked directly at her. To my great-niece Margaret, Chen, I leave the family homestead located at 847 Elm Street, along with all contents therein. The room went completely silent for about 3 seconds. Then Richard started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but the kind of full-belly laugh people make when they hear a really good joke. "The old house," he said, wiping his eyes. "Uncle Harold left her that falling-down shack? That's hilarious." Victoria joined in, though her laugh sounded more mean than amused. "Oh my God, that place has been empty for like 20 years. The roof probably caves in when it rains. Poor Margaret's going to need a tetanus shot just to walk through the front door." Other family members started whispering and snickering. Margaret felt her cheeks burning, but she kept her expression neutral. She had plenty of practice dealing with people who thought they were better than her. Attorney Williams looked uncomfortable with the family's reaction, but he continued reading the legal language about property transfers and inheritance taxes. Margaret tried to pay attention, but the words felt fuzzy in her head. She kept thinking about Richard's laughter and the way Victoria had said "poor Margaret" like she was some kind of charity case. The truth was, Margaret had heard about the old house before. Her grandmother had mentioned it sometimes, talking about how Harold grew up there before the family made their fortune. It was supposedly in a neighborhood that used to be nice but had gotten rough over the years. Margaret had always imagined it as a small, sad place that Harold was probably embarrassed to own. After the will reading ended, the family members clustered together, talking excitedly about their new wealth. Margaret heard snippets of their conversations about renovation plans, investment strategies, and expensive vacations they were already planning. Nobody talked to her directly, but she caught plenty of sideways glances and whispered comments. "She'll probably have to sell it, just to afford the demolition costs," someone said. "I wonder if Harold was going senile at the end. Why else would he waste a perfectly good inheritance on her?" Maybe he thought it was funny. You know how weird he got in his last few years. Margaret gathered her purse and headed for the door. She had learned a long time ago that the best response to rich people's cruelty was simple dignity. Let them laugh now. At least she had inherited something, even if it wasn't worth much. Attorney Williams caught up with her in the hallway, carrying a manila envelope and looking genuinely apologetic. "Miss Chen, I wanted to give you the keys and property documents personally. I also want you to know that your great-uncle was very specific about this bequest. He spent a lot of time thinking about it." Margaret took the envelope, feeling the weight of old-fashioned skeleton keys inside. "Thank you, I'm sure it will be fine." The lawyer hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, but then just shook her hand and wished her luck. On the bus ride home, Margaret stared out the window and tried not to think about Richard's laughter. She had never expected to inherit millions of dollars, so she wasn't really disappointed. But the family's reaction stung more than she wanted to admit. It reminded her of every time she had felt like an outsider, every moment when her worn clothes and practical shoes had marked her as different from people with real money. Rosa was waiting for her at the diner with coffee and curiosity. "So, what? Did the rich uncle leave you?" "A house," Margaret said. "An old house that everyone thinks is worthless." Rosa raised her eyebrows. "A whole house? That doesn't sound worthless to me. Even a crappy house is still a house. That's more than most people get." Margaret pulled out the keys. Old brass things that looked like they belonged in a museum. "It's been empty for 20 years. The family was laughing about how it's probably falling apart." "Rich people laugh at everything that isn't covered in gold," Rosa said. "Maybe it's better than they think. Maybe your uncle knew something they didn't." Margaret doubted that. Harold Blackwood had been many things, but sentimental wasn't one of them. Still, Rosa had a point. A house was a house. Even if it needed work, even if it was in a bad neighborhood, it was more than Margaret had ever owned before. That night, She lay in her small apartment and thought about 847 Elm Street. She wondered what Harold's childhood had been like in that house, back before the family became rich and complicated. She wondered why he had kept it all these years, if it was really as worthless as everyone seemed to think. Most of all, she wondered what she was going to find when she finally got up, the courage to unlock that front door and step inside. Margaret stared at the house keys for 3 weeks before she worked up the courage to actually use them. Every time she thought about driving to 847 Elm Street, she remembered Richard's laughter and Victoria's smirking face. What if they were right? What if the house really was just a crumbling mess that would cost her more money than she could ever afford to fix? But curiosity finally won over fear. She called her friend Tommy, who worked construction, and owed her a favor from when she helped him through his divorce last year. Tommy was the kind of guy who could look at a building and tell you exactly what was wrong with it and how much it would cost to make it right. "You sure you want to do this today?" Tommy asked as they drove through increasingly unfamiliar neighborhoods. "Weather report says it might rain." Margaret clutched the keys tighter. "I've been putting this off long enough. Besides, if the roof leaks, we'll find out today." Elm Street turned out to be in a part of town that had definitely seen better days. But it wasn't the disaster zone Margaret had been expecting. The houses were older, sure, and some needed fresh paint or new fences. But there were also signs of life everywhere. Kids playing on front porches, older people working in small gardens, neighbors talking over backyard fences. It felt like a real community, not the kind of sterile perfection Harold had lived in with his mansion. Number 847 sat on a corner lot, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes and trees that had been left to grow wild for years. The house itself was bigger than Margaret had imagined, a solid-looking craftsman style with good bones and character that modern houses never seemed to have. The paint was peeling and the front porch sagged a little, but the structure looked sound. "Well, it's not fallen down," Tommy said, walking around the outside and poking at the foundation with his boot. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing. These old craftsman houses were made to last." Margaret took a deep breath and walked up to the front door. The key turned easily, like Harold had kept the locks maintained even while the house sat empty. The door opened with a long creak that sounded exactly like what you'd expect from a house in a ghost story. The smell hit her first. Not the musty, moldy smell she had been dreading, but something warmer. Old wood and furniture polish, with just a hint of the lavender sachets her grandmother used to put in closet drawers. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through dirty windows, but the air felt surprisingly fresh. "Someone's been taking care of this place," Tommy said, running his finger along a windowsill. "Look, there's dust, but not 20 years' worth. And I don't see any water damage on the ceilings." Margaret walked deeper into the house, feeling like she was stepping back in time. The living room still had furniture in it, covered with white sheets that made everything look like sleeping ghosts. When she pulled back one of the sheets, she found a beautiful wooden rocking chair that looked hand-carved. Another sheet revealed a bookshelf filled with old leather-bound books. The kitchen was straight out of the 1950s, with mint green cabinets and black and white checkered linoleum that was worn but clean. Someone had left a few dishes in the dish rack, and there were still spices in the spice rack, though Margaret couldn't tell how old they were. But it was the photographs that really got to her. They were everywhere, covering the mantelpiece and hanging on the walls in mismatched frames. Pictures of Harold as a young boy, grinning and missing his front teeth. Photos of family gatherings with people Margaret didn't recognize but who had familiar faces. Wedding pictures, birthday parties, Christmas mornings with a tree that took up half the living room. "This is weird," she said to Tommy, who was examining the electrical outlets. "Why would Harold keep all this stuff here? He had that huge mansion with barely any personal things in it. But this place is like a museum of his childhood." Tommy shrugged. "Rich people are weird about sentimental stuff. Maybe this was his way of staying connected to where he came from." They spent the next hour exploring the upstairs, which had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom that needed updating but was perfectly functional. Margaret was starting to feel hopeful. The house needed work, but it wasn't the money pit everyone had made it out to be. She could actually live here if she wanted to. That's when Tommy noticed something odd in the basement. "Hey, Margaret, come down here and look at this." The basement was typical for an old house, with stone walls and a concrete floor. But Tommy was standing at the far end, frowning at the wall. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Well, I was measuring to see if you could put a washer and dryer down here, and the dimensions don't match up. This basement is about 8 feet shorter than it should be, given the size of the house." Margaret looked at the wall Tommy was studying. It looked normal to her, just old stone and mortar like the rest of the basement. But Tommy had been in construction for 15 years. If he said something was wrong with the dimensions, something was probably wrong. Maybe they built it weird back then, she suggested. Tommy shook his head and started running his hands along the wall, tapping every few inches. "No, craftsman houses were really well planned. Everything had a purpose and fit together perfectly. This wall—" He paused, tapping harder, in one spot. "This doesn't sound right. It sounds hollow." Margaret felt her heart start to beat faster. "Hollow how?" Instead of answering, Tommy pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, examining the wall more closely. After a few minutes, he found what he was looking for. A section of stones that looked slightly different from the others, like they had been removed and replaced. "I think this might be a hidden panel," he said. "Help me see if we can move these stones." It took both of them pushing and pulling, but eventually they found the trick. 3 specific stones had to be pressed in the right order, and then a whole section of the wall swung inward like a door. Behind the false wall was a room Margaret never could have imagined. It was like stepping into a different world. The hidden room was clean and dry, with proper lighting and climate control that must have been installed much more recently than the house was built. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and every shelf was filled with carefully organized boxes, each one labeled in Harold's neat handwriting. "Holy cow," Tommy whispered. "Your uncle built himself a secret room." Margaret walked into the room with shaking legs. The boxes closest to the door were labeled things like pocket watches 1890, 1920, and fountain pens European. She opened one at random and found herself looking at a collection of vintage wristwatches, each one nestled in its own padded slot with a little card describing where Harold had found it and what made it special. Another box contained old coins, some so old that Margaret couldn't even read the dates. There were boxes of vintage jewelry, antique books, even what looked like old baseball cards. Everything was perfectly preserved and documented, like Harold had been running his own private museum. "Margaret," Tommy called from the other side of the room. "You need to see this." He was standing in front of a desk that looked like it belonged in a library, complete with an old-fashioned banker's lamp and neat stacks of notebooks. On top of the desk was a leather-bound journal, open to a page covered in Harold's handwriting. Margaret picked up the journal and read the top of the page out loud. "Collection Log, Volume 12. Items acquired this month and their estimated values." She flipped through a few pages, her eyes getting wider with each entry. Harold hadn't just been collecting random old things. He had been carefully researching and acquiring items that he believed would increase in value over time. Each entry included where he had bought something, what he had paid for it, and his notes about its potential worth. Some of the numbers made Margaret dizzy. A set of fountain pens he had bought for $50 in 1987 that he estimated were now worth over $2,000. A collection of vintage postcards purchased for $25 that current market research suggested could sell for $1,500. "Tommy," she said quietly, "I think Harold wasn't just collecting things. I think he was investing in them. All of this stuff, it might actually be worth real money." Tommy was examining a box filled with what looked like old photographs. "These aren't just any old photos," he said. "Look at this signature in the corner. I think these might be vintage prints by famous photographers." Margaret sank into Harold's desk chair, trying to process what they had discovered. The family had laughed at her inheritance, calling the house a worthless dump. But Harold had been using it to hide what looked like decades' worth of careful collecting and investing. And if his notes were accurate, she might be sitting in a room worth more money than she had ever imagined possible. The best part was they had only looked at a few boxes so far. The room was packed with shelves, and each shelf held dozens of carefully labeled containers. Margaret had a feeling they had only discovered the tip of Harold's hidden iceberg. Outside, it started to rain, just like the weather report had predicted. But inside the secret room, Margaret felt like she was sitting in the middle of the best treasure hunt of her life. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those shelves packed with Harold's mysterious boxes. She kept thinking about his careful handwriting in that journal, documenting every single item like he was building something important. By 6 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and called in sick to work. "You found what in your basement?" Rosa asked when Margaret called to explain why she wouldn't be at the diner. "A secret room full of Harold's collections." "Tommy, think some of it might be valuable, but I won't know until I really look through everything." "Girl, you better be careful," Rosa warned. "Don't go alone. Take Tommy with you again." But when Margaret called Tommy, he was already committed to a big roofing job that couldn't wait. She thought about postponing her return to the house, but curiosity was eating her alive. She promised Rosa she'd be careful and drove to Elm Street, with a thermos of coffee and a bag full of notebooks to keep track of what she found. The house felt different in the morning light, less mysterious, more welcoming. Margaret had left the secret room open the night before, and walking back down to the basement felt like returning to a treasure cave from a childhood story. She decided to start with Harold's desk, figuring his. Journals might give her clues about how to understand the collection. What she found was even better than she had hoped. Harold hadn't just kept records of what he bought and when. He had created an entire system for organizing his treasures, complete with maps showing where different types of items were stored. Throughout the house. "Items stored throughout the house," Margaret read aloud from Harold's master notebook. "What does that mean?" The answer was on the next page. Harold had been hiding things everywhere, not just in the secret room. The basement collection was apparently just his most valuable items. According to his notes, there were additional hiding spots in almost every room upstairs. Margaret felt like she was about to start the world's most exciting scavenger hunt. Her first stop was the living room, where Harold's notes indicated she should look for loose floorboard near the fireplace, third board from the left. It took some searching, but she finally found a board that gave slightly when she stepped on it. Underneath was a metal box containing what Harold's notes described as emergency cash and small valuables. The cash alone was more money than Margaret had ever seen in one place. Nearly $5,000 in 20s and hundreds, wrapped in rubber bands with a note that said, "For immediate expenses while cataloging the collection." But it was the small velvet bags that really caught her attention. Each one contained jewelry that looked old and expensive, antique brooches, vintage rings, and a necklace that sparkled even in the dim living room light. Harold's notebook told her exactly what each piece was and where he had bought it. The necklace alone, according to his research, was worth over $8,000. Margaret sat on the dusty floor, holding jewelry worth more than she made in 6 months, and tried to wrap her head around what was happening to her life. The next hiding spot was in the master bedroom, behind a loose section of baseboard near the closet. This one contained Harold's collection of vintage fountain pens, each one in its own protective case with documentation about its history and value. Margaret picked up a pen that looked like it was made of genuine silver and read Harold's note. Waterman 18-karat gold nib, circa 1925. Purchased at estate sale for $75, Current estimated value, $2,400. Room by room, Harold had turned the entire house into a treasure vault. In the kitchen, behind a false back in one of the cabinets, she found his collection of antique silver serving pieces. In the bathroom, inside a hollowed-out section of wall behind the medicine cabinet, was a box of vintage watches that made the ones in the basement look ordinary by comparison. But it was in the attic that Margaret found Harold's greatest surprise. The attic stairs creaked ominously as she climbed them, following Harold's map to a hiding spot described as behind the old steamer trunk, inside the wall cavity. The attic was full of the kind of forgotten furniture and dusty boxes that every old house seems to collect over the years. But when Margaret moved the steamer trunk Harold had mentioned, she found something that made her heart stop. Built into the wall was a proper safe, the old-fashioned kind with a combination lock. And taped to the top of the safe was an envelope with Margaret's name on it in Harold's handwriting. Inside the envelope was not just the combination to the safe, but a letter that explained everything. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have proven yourself worthy of what I'm about to show you. The family always thought I was eccentric for keeping this old house, but the truth is I kept it because I needed somewhere to build something that would outlast the petty greed and materialism that consumed the rest of our family." Margaret had to sit down on an old chair to keep reading. "I have been watching all of you for years, waiting to see who among my relatives had the character and patience to appreciate what I was building here. You never asked me for money. You never tried to flatter me or curry favor for an inheritance. When I saw you at the grocery store 2 years ago, you were kind to the cashier even though she was slow and made mistakes. You helped an elderly man reach something on a high shelf even though you were clearly in a hurry. These small acts of character told me everything I needed to know." The letter went on to explain Harold's plan. For 30 years, he had been quietly building a collection of items that he believed would increase in value over time. Not flashy things that would impress his wealthy relatives, but carefully researched pieces with genuine historical and artistic value. He had stored the most precious items in the safe Margaret was about to open. "The combination is your grandmother's birthday," the letter continued. "She was the only person in this family who ever understood that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the things we preserve and pass down to future generations. Everything in this house is now yours, but I hope you will see it as I did. Not just as valuable objects, but as pieces of history that deserve to be preserved and appreciated." Margaret's hands shook as she entered her grandmother's birthday into the combination lock. The safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing contents that made everything else she had found look insignificant by comparison. The first thing she saw was a painting, small but exquisite, with a signature in the corner that looked familiar. Harold's documentation, stored in a fireproof folder inside the safe, identified it as an early work by an artist who had since become internationally famous. His notes estimated its current value at over $200,000. Behind the painting were more treasures that Harold had been saving for last, rare coins that dated back to the 1800s, including several that collectors would pay enormous sums to own. A collection of vintage guitars, including one that Harold's research suggested was played by a famous musician in the 1960s. And at the very back of the safe, a small wooden box that contained Harold's most precious discovery of all. Inside the box were gold coins that Harold had found hidden in the house's walls during a renovation project 20 years earlier. According to his research, they had belonged to his great-grandfather, who had hidden them during the Great Depression and died before he could retrieve them. Harold had spent years researching their history and value, and his final estimate made Margaret's knees weak. The coins alone were worth nearly $500,000. Margaret closed the safe and sat in the dusty attic for a long time, trying to process what Harold had done for her. He hadn't just left her a house. He had left her a lifetime of careful planning, research, and preservation. Every item in the collection had been chosen not just for its value, but for its story and its place in history. When she finally made it back downstairs, Margaret called Rosa with hands that were still shaking. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Harold didn't leave me a worthless old house. He left me a fortune, and I think I'm just getting started." Margaret knew she needed professional help to understand exactly what Harold had left her. The numbers in his notebook seemed impossible, but she had learned not to underestimate her great-uncle's research abilities. She spent 2 weeks carefully, photographing everything and making detailed lists before she worked up the courage to contact an appraiser. The appraiser she chose was Linda Peterson, a woman in her 60s who specialized in estate valuations and had a reputation for being both honest and thorough. When Margaret called to explain the situation, Linda's first response was skeptical. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've learned that most people overestimate what their inherited items are worth. Family stories about valuable antiques usually turn out to be wishful thinking." But when Margaret mentioned Harold Blackwood's name and described some of the items she had found, Linda's tone changed completely. "Harold Blackwood? I knew Harold. He used to consult with me sometimes when he was researching purchases. That man had one of the best eyes for undervalued antiques I've ever encountered. If Harold Blackwood left you a collection, I need to see it immediately." Linda arrived at the house the following Monday with a team of specialists and enough equipment to stock a small museum. Margaret watched nervously as they examined Harold's treasures with magnifying glasses, special lights, and reference books that looked like they weighed 50 pounds each. The process took 3 days. 3 days of careful examination, hushed conversations between experts, and phone calls to auction houses and museums. Margaret tried to stay out of their way, but she couldn't help hovering nearby, trying to read their expressions for clues about what they were discovering. On Wednesday afternoon, Linda called Margaret into the living room where she had spread out pages and pages of evaluation reports. "Margaret, I need you to sit down," Linda said. Her voice was serious, but there was something else in it too. Excitement, maybe, or disbelief. "In 40 years of doing estate appraisals, I have never seen a collection like this. Your great-uncle wasn't just collecting valuable items. He was assembling what amounts to a curated museum of American craftsmanship and artistry from the past century." Linda picked up her master list and began reading numbers that made Margaret feel dizzy all over again. The coins from the attic safe were worth even more than Harold had estimated. Some of them were so rare that collectors would fight bidding, wars to own them. Total value, $650,000. The painting from the safe had been authenticated as a genuine early work by an artist whose pieces now sold for millions. Conservative auction estimate, $400,000. The vintage guitars included 2 instruments that had been played by musicians who were now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Combined value, $300,000. Harold's jewelry collection, scattered throughout the house's hiding spots, contained pieces from some of the most respected craftsmen of the early 20th century. Total appraised value, $275,000. Even the items Margaret had thought were relatively ordinary turned out to be extraordinary. Harold's fountain pen collection included several pens owned by famous writers. His vintage watch collection contained timepieces made by legendary Swiss craftsmen. His photography collection included original prints by artists whose work now hung in major galleries. When Linda finished reading, she looked up at Margaret with something that might have been awe. "The total appraised value of everything we found is approximately $2.3 million. And Margaret, that's a conservative estimate for insurance purposes. At auction, with the right buyers, this collection could bring significantly more." Margaret stared at the papers in Linda's hands. $2.3 million. It was more money than she had ever imagined having. More than Richard and Victoria had inherited in their flashy bequests from Harold's will. But the money wasn't even the most amazing part of the discovery. It was Harold's final letter, the one Linda had found tucked inside his master collection notebook. "There's one more thing," Linda said, handing Margaret an envelope she hadn't seen before. This was with his collection records. "It's addressed to you specifically, but it looks like he meant for you to find it only after you had discovered everything else." Margaret opened the envelope with hands that had gotten steadier over the past few days. Inside was Harold's final message, written in his careful handwriting on expensive stationery. "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then my plan has worked perfectly. You have proven yourself to be exactly what I hoped. Someone with the patience to look beyond surface appearances and the character to appreciate what truly matters." The letter explained Harold's ultimate strategy. He had deliberately given his immediate heirs the obvious wealth, the mansions, cars, and investment accounts that would likely be spent within a generation. But the real treasure, the collection, that had taken him decades to build, he had saved for someone who would understand its deeper value. I watched Richard and Victoria grow up caring only about money and status. They would have sold everything in this collection within a year, never understanding that these items are pieces of history that deserve to be preserved. But you, Margaret, have shown me something different. You appreciate craftsmanship. You value history. You understand that some things are worth more than their price tags. Harold's letter revealed that he had been planning this inheritance for over 5 years, ever since he had started noticing Margaret's character during their few brief encounters. The grocery store meeting that had seemed so awkward to Margaret had actually been a test. Harold had been watching to see how she treated people, how she carried herself, whether she showed the kind of integrity he was looking for in an heir. "The family will probably be angry when they learn what you have inherited," Harold's letter continued. "Richard especially will claim that I was mentally incompetent or that you somehow manipulated me. Let them talk. I have documented every purchase, every decision, every legal step I took to ensure this inheritance would reach you. My lawyers have instructions that will make any legal challenge impossible to win." The letter concluded with Harold's hopes for what Margaret would do with the collection. "I trust you to be a good steward of these treasures. Some pieces you may wish to keep for their sentimental value or historical significance. Others might find good homes in museums where they can be appreciated by future generations. And yes, if you need to sell some items to secure your financial future, that is exactly what I hoped would happen. This collection was meant to change your life, Margaret. Use it wisely." Margaret folded the letter carefully and looked around the house that had transformed her world. She thought about Harold's plan, how he had turned what looked like a cruel joke into the most generous gift imaginable. News of the appraisal results reached the family within a week, exactly as Harold had predicted. Richard called first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "There has to be some mistake," he said. "Uncle Harold couldn't have left you millions of dollars worth of stuff. We're going to contest this. We're going to prove that he was senile or that you influenced him somehow." Victoria was even more direct when she called later that day. "I don't know how you tricked Uncle Harold, but we're not going to let you get away with it. That collection should belong to the family, not to some distant relative who barely knew him." But Harold had anticipated their reaction perfectly. When Richard and Victoria hired lawyers to contest the inheritance, they discovered that Harold had spent years documenting his mental competence and his reasons for his final bequests. Every purchase in the collection was legally documented. Every decision was explained in detailed notes that showed careful planning rather than senile confusion. The legal challenge failed completely, just as Harold had predicted. Margaret decided to follow Harold's suggestions about what to do with her inheritance. She kept the items that had the most personal meaning, some of the jewelry that had belonged to Harold's mother, a few of the photographs that showed family history, and one of the vintage guitars because she had always wanted to learn to play, the sao. Rest she divided between museum donations and careful sales to collectors who would appreciate their historical significance. The money from those sales, combined with Harold's emergency fund, was enough to secure Margaret's future in ways she had never thought possible. She quit her job at the diner, but not before giving Rosa a bonus that let her friend take the vacation she had been dreaming about for years. She used part of Harold's gift to go back to school and study art history, something she had always been interested in but could never afford to pursue. The old house on Elm Street became Margaret's home, after she had it lovingly restored to its original craftsman beauty. She kept Harold's secret room as a study, lined with books about antiques and art history. Sometimes, when she sat at Harold's old desk, she could almost feel him smiling at how perfectly his plan had worked. The family never apologized for their initial cruelty, but Margaret didn't need their apology. She had something much better. She had Harold's trust, his carefully built legacy, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the last laugh really is the best laugh of all.